So that was the first thing in which I really felt like I wasn't acting as a prosecutor.
Right.
I was acting as a truth finder. The question isn't how much are you going to punish somebody if you got a sustained complaint. The question is whether you're going to develop them or discharge them.
Welcome back to Internal Affairs, a police podcast here with the host, the IA guy, Mark Perez, retired deputy chief from the Los Angeles Police Department, is here today. He's Code 6 with us. And we're going to have a really good conversation about, not just about internal affairs, but the fact that there was a lot happening even before I did my tour in internal affairs. So really honored and blessed. All guests are special, but I really feel that Mark, because that's what he wants me to call him, instead of deputy chief, or chief is what we do in our culture. So let's get him on board and get to know Mark a little better, and stand by. Okay, Code 6, Mark Perez.
Hi, Marlon.
Thanks for showing up, man.
My pleasure, believe me.
You know, I got to be honest with you. I had John Mutch here, and we talked about this, where he's our mutual friend of ours. And we were having this conversation. He goes, you know what, you got to get a hold of Mark Perez. And I'm thinking to myself, well, why would the deputy chief, which, by the way, you pretty much kind of revolutionized, or you made a very good attempt to revolutionize internal affairs, for all the reasons that I decided to do this podcast. And I'm like, you know what, I think I still have his number. So I did keep your number. And I got a hold of you, and here you are. And I am just, I'm happy to know that we're going to have a really good conversation about all this. And I know you have so much insight. So, thanks for being here.
I'm glad to be here. Go for it.
Right off the bat, so I get a hold of you, and you see this Internal Affairs Police podcast. What I would like to know is, how familiar are you with police podcasts? And what was your first thoughts when you saw Internal Affairs, a police podcast?
I'm not familiar with a lot of police podcasts. I've seen a few. And when I saw this one, I was particularly happy to see it, because it's one of the best kept secrets, is that nobody knows what internal affairs is, and the few people who think they do don't really understand it. And the other part of it is that when you understand what internal affairs does, it's nested in other things. And if you want to promote, if you want to grow in the organization, and you don't know what internal affairs is, you're in a really, really sorry position.
Would it be fair to say you're in a really bad position, because a lot of issues that you deal with, whether it's operational functions or internal functions, have a lot to do with discipline? They
do. And if you think about what discipline, or particularly internal affairs as a bureaucratic function and system. All right. So what is in some respects, what is the purpose of that? Well, it's to protect the people from the police. Okay. So that's one of the things that internal affairs is supposed to do. So if you don't have that, then what happens? You have some rogue cops doing some really awful things.
The buck wild, or people just...
And the administration, regardless of what police department it is, recognizes that. So do the politicians. They realize if you don't have some function to govern the police, then you will have your own kind of anarchy in the very institution that should be preventing it. So it's when you look at, for example, in LAPD, when you and I were going through, it was built into the manual that an internal affairs assignment was called a what? Coveted assignment.
Yeah, yes.
It was literally called that in the manual. And the reason it was called a coveted assignment is because everyone knew that if you had gone through internal affairs, you had a glimpse of the inside of the police department that no one else had.
Yeah. And on that note, or I should say in that vein, as we speak, look, you came in the academy back in 1982, so you spent the majority of your career in the early 80s into the mid 80s. What was it, just out of curiosity, did anybody tell you anything about internal affairs, or what was your impression of internal affairs at that time?
It varied because there were different people with different perspectives. You would expect that. Some people who had been through a personnel complaint and didn't come out of it very well.
They're just going to, they're like,
Oh yeah,
"Hell,
they're really mad. And then you get others who say, no big deal. And then others they were just mystified by it. They said, it's the burn 'em to learn 'em team, And I said, okay, well, I've not had to go through it, so I don't worry about it.
Right.
So I had this composite of views that no one of which persuaded me one way or the other.
Until you got to internal affairs. And what we share in common, which I didn't know, is you were an advocate. You were an advocate in the early 90s. As a matter of fact, in 1992, you began the role of an advocate in internal affairs. Let me ask you this. When you got into internal affairs, did you go straight into being an advocate, or did you actually have to investigate, or how did that work?
Well, that's an interesting story, too. So I did not ask to go to internal affairs. So I was an adjutant to a captain. So
Okay.
I was a sergeant. Captain, we were there on literally a Friday afternoon. We're ready to go home. It's about 5 o'clock. I go into his office. Said, boss, here's the end of watch stuff. Let's go through this and then go. The phone rings. He picks it up. This is how the conversation goes. Yes, sir. Mark Perez. Yes. Monday, 08:30, advocate section. He'll be there. Click. He looks at me and says, you're going to the advocate section on Monday at 08:30. And I looked at him and I said, what is the advocate section? I didn't know. I had no clue what it was. I'd never heard about it. So I'm going to an assignment that's a coveted assignment. And it's unique within internal affairs. It's unique within LAPD. It's unique within policing. I have no clue what I'm up against or what I'm going to do. So I got selected. I went down there, 8:30, and I knew the lieutenant who was there.
Okay.
And I had worked for her when I was a patrol officer in Northeast. So I said, Lieutenant, why am I here? And she had a really kind of an interesting voice. She was a little older. And she says, because I remember you when you applied for a P3 position, a training officer position, and you didn't get it. And you came to me and you asked me why. And I told you, and it had to do with, we had to have a certain proportion of certain people. You didn't get mad. But what I liked about you is that during the interview, you asked me questions. And I could tell you were thinking. And I need somebody who can think here. Wow. And so she was personal friends with Darrell F. Gates. She went to Darrell F. Gates and said, I have this person who works Southwest Division, a sergeant, I want him here. Darrell F. Gates says, you can have him. So the call goes to my captain. Captain says, yes, sir. Boom.
And here we are. Sleepless nights preparing for this tribunal, what I like to call like a mini civil trial. It's almost as if you're kind of playing the prosecution role, which I would like to ask you. We shared the same thing in common. I actually oraled for the spot and I went straight into the advocate section. So I kind of, well, that's not true. I don't know exactly what I was getting into. I kind of had an idea, but boy, it was, for me, I can say that it had a major impact on how I see police work.
Oh, yeah.
I think that, would you think the same, or
Yes.
what are your thoughts about that when you did that role?
Yeah, that role, I think, really changed the trajectory of my career.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. Well, one of them was the way I had to think afterwards. So when you go in and you present a case that may get an officer fired, and it's an adversarial hearing, so there's very much, it's like a court martial. It's literally patterned after that.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, there's a lot of things going on there. And you have to recognize that someone's career is at stake here, but so is the reputation of the police department. And the only thing that really matters in all of this is what's true.
Yeah. I was told, and we had this conversation already, hey, Marlon, you know what? Don't think of this as a prosecutorial role. You know what? At the time, I didn't let that kind of resonate. But as the years have gone by, especially now that I'm retired and I teach this stuff, right, for Savage Training Group, I often ask myself, it's almost like I want to call BS. I honestly, I think it was a prosecutorial role because I'm sitting on this side representing the chief of police at its highest rank, right, if you will, on his behalf to present to this 3-panel member and pretty much introduce all this evidence, bring in witnesses so they can hear all this testimony to say that that accused employee, a colleague of mine, is either lying or they did something really, really bad. What's your thoughts?
Well, the nature of the hearing is adversarial, so it gives the impression of a prosecutorial role. The difference is that you're not representing the state
Right.
like a prosecutor would. You don't have a crime. What you do have is a case that has been developed by the internal affairs investigators that you as an advocate have done research on. So what happens? What did you do as an advocate? Well, the first thing you do is you got all the paper documents.
Yes.
Next thing you do, you got, back then, was cassette tapes.
Yes.
So you listened to all the interviews and then you compared them against the documents. And if there was any kind of difference, well, then that was an issue you had to solve before you went before the board.
Right.
So you have done your own due diligence on the case. So you basically looked over the case yourself. Finally, in a way, even the chief of police doesn't get to look at it.
Correct.
Yeah. So when you go in there, you're saying, board, this is what I've found. This is what I've seen. This is what the investigators came up with, and I'm going to bring in eyewitnesses to testify to this. Have at it. I never felt like I had to prosecute anybody. Did I ever feel like there was adversity in it? Of course.
Yes.
Because the defense rep has an obligation to represent his client with as much ardor as the law will allow. Mm-hmm. And I sincerely really appreciated that and respected it. I didn't respect all of the ones who did it because sometimes they did things that just weren't called for. Right. But in that regard, it was not prosecutorial, but it could certainly feel like it.
I'm building up to your time as a deputy chief when you got to internal affairs, and I'm building my way up there. But I got to ask you, and I don't have many opportunities to ask an ex-advocate, but did you sometimes feel like the quality of the investigation wasn't really 51%, wasn't really more likely than not? And if so, did you sense some frustration or
Yeah. So
what's your thoughts on that?
Let me give you two very interesting stories. The first one was a story in which when I read some of the summaries of the statements made by witnesses, mm-hmm. they did not match up with what I heard in the audio tapes. Mm-hmm. I took those to my boss and I said, boss, there's a disparity here. What's said here was not said there. The chief of police is relying on this paper document. He doesn't have time to listen to 42 hours worth of audio.
Correct.
So I did. And I'm telling you right now, you need to have somebody second guess me here, but I'm going to tell you what you're going to find. This does not match that. This was the crucial feature of the case, mm-hmm. without which you do not have a case. We do not have a case. Handed it back to her, and she did exactly what I supposed, and that case went away. Mm. So that was the first thing in which I really felt like I wasn't acting as a prosecutor.
Right.
I was acting as a truth finder.
Yeah.
The next one came when I had a case, and it was kind of a wobbly case. I wasn't quite sure because some of the witnesses were iffy. I brought it in, and the defense rep made some motions, and I didn't have any problems with them. And so we go on with the case, and it's obvious to me that this case is weak. And by the time we were done, my closing remarks were to that effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was true.
Yeah.
And here's what was really interesting. That defense rep went and reported me for misconduct.
Wow.
Yes. Now, I didn't get a personnel complaint,
right,
because what I did wasn't misconduct.
Well,
but just imagine, you're a defense rep, the advocate says what you're saying,
I'm and then you go, out, bro.
And then you go and report him for misconduct?
Yeah.
Basically what he said was he threw the case. No, I didn't throw the case. No. I presented the facts as they were.
Yeah.
And the assessment, after it was done, what could I say otherwise?
Yeah.
I'd be lying.
Not only that, then you don't want to be the Blue Falcon, if you will, and say, well, hey, I just put it on.
Yeah.
The one that you should really be talking to is the IO, not mm-hmm. me. And if it's the IO that we don't want to throw under the bus, if you will,
Yeah.
well, then what about all these levels of review? Hey, man, by the time it got to me, it's already been reviewed like by 6 different levels. So it seems as though, and maybe you can kind of agree with me in this, but those type of cases kind of gives it a bad rap about what IA does.
I agree. It really does. So the question is now, not does it happen, but why?
Yes.
And so the why is a function of a lack of training and a lack of experience. And the question is then, why is there a lack of training and why is there a lack of experience and why are they put there when they don't have those two things?
No, totally.
Yeah.
I appreciate all that. Look, thank you for pointing a lot of these major issues that I definitely would like to discuss. I know one of these is the fact that you got selected, you know, as we're moving, we're going down a trip down memory lane, if you will. And I got to ask you, so here you are as a deputy chief. You were in Employment Relations Administration, and for all these who are listening, watching, you are the administrator for pretty much the entire department. And you're dealing with a lot of these labor issues, right? And then lo and behold, I suppose you get called in again, and they say, okay, I don't know if it was the same kind of phone call that you got from your boss, but tell us, you went to Internal Affairs as a deputy chief. How did that all go down?
That was an interesting thing. So it was not a phone call. It wasn't an assignment phone call like I got when I went to the advocate section, you know, where the chief just called him and says, get him down there. It wasn't that at all. So the chief of police, when he's going to assign somebody to a deputy chief spot, he's looking at several candidates. He's not looking at just one person to send there. So I was among several others that he had talked to. When he brought me in, he had already brought me in a couple of other times for a couple of other deputy chief positions that I said I didn't want to work. And bottom line was I didn't want to work for the person that I would have to work with. So I don't need to go any further with that.
No.
The bottom line was
that still happens to this
I'm glad to hear that. That's just reality, isn't it?
That's the human element. We'll talk about.
So there's no amount of money, prestige, perks. They're going to make me do things with people I don't want to do them with.
100% agree.
Yeah. But this was another thing. So he brings me in. He says, I have an opening in Professional Standards Bureau. Are you interested? I said, now, boss, that is interesting. He said, tell me about it. I said, before you send me there, I want to tell you right now that if you send me there, my intention is to change the world. So he's got these glasses, and he looks over the top. Now, this is Brat, you know, with his Boston accent. He says, Mark, what are you talking about? So I said, Chief, you know, we've been doing internal affairs now for, 70 years, 80 years. Yeah. This kind of discipline system goes all the way back to the 1930s. It actually wasn't designed to do what it's doing. And I think the design is completely inept, that it does not serve the purposes it was intended to serve. And that the fundamental problem is that the wrong question is being asked. And he said, well, what do you mean by that? And I said, the question isn't how much are you going to punish somebody if you got a sustained complaint. The question is whether you're going to develop them or discharge them. That's a fundamentally different question.
Big time.
Very, very big.
Well, it's way two different avenues.
Completely different first principles. And they're both based in different principles. When you realize that the discipline system as internal affairs operates in its kind of bureaucracy, it has different phases. So you have the investigative phase. So that is the complaint has come in, you got an investigator or a team assigned to do it. They develop the facts. That's phase 2. So phase 1 is the intake. So phase 2 is really a crucial part. So now they got the investigation. Now the next thing is, how are you going to adjudicate it? Now, once you've gotten to that place, let's say you have a sustained complaint. If it's not sustained, very easy to deal with. Okay, it's unfounded, easy, it goes away. Not sustained, that's not so good, but that's just, could be a problem of the uncertainty of the facts. But let's just talk about sustained, because that's really that's where all the cops care about.
It occurred.
It happened.
It happened.
It happened, and it was a violation of the policy as stated.
Yep.
Yeah, so those are the conditions. So now what do you do? So what is the standard model? The standard model is you give them a suspension, a warning, a reprimand, fire them, or in some cases, a demotion. So you have this suite of options for the punishment. Now, what happens when you're done with that punishment? Now, this is something I thought about for a long time, and I did a lot of background research on this for a long time before I even got in that position, because I was very interested in this. Because I thought for years, especially as an employee relations administrator, and I was dealing with the unions all the time, particularly the police union, which I had various relationships with, but one of the things I was very attentive to was their thoughts on the discipline system. And as I was thinking about it and realizing, what is it that really goes awry when an officer commits misconduct? Isn't that really the central question? So that was what triggered the mantra that I kept uttering, which was develop or discharge. You either develop them because they're worthy of development, or you discharge them because they're not. And it's not a simple matter of moral worth. It's a question of whether, and we're going back to earlier principles, which is, do they adopt and embrace the values and principles that we have, or do they not? Now, some misconduct occurs because they don't understand a procedure. That's pretty easy. That you teach them the procedure and you say, all right, there's some values implicated in that procedure. Do you understand them? Yeah, I do, and now that I do, you won't have to worry about it again. We've just developed somebody.
Yeah.
But then there are other values that occur and that are implicated in other kinds of misconduct. And if it's misconduct that deserves to be fired, then you've already shown that you don't care about our values at all, that you just are willing to turn your back on them. Others, it's a function of them not really recognizing them. So we don't do an exhaustive job of inculcating our values at the beginning. The academy tries to do that, but you don't have enough time to do that. So when an officer goes awry, and this applied to people who weren't officers too. I mean, at the time I was doing this, you had 13,000 people. 3,000 weren't police officers. So this applied to everybody. Same problem. So I was envisioning a process in which the captain, when you had a sustained complaint, would engage the officer, first of all, in an understanding of what the values were that were implicated in that particular misconduct. The officer didn't have to say a word, just here are the values. Do you understand the values? Now, he would have a defense rep with him. Fine, it certainly should. And then what are you going to do about this in the future? So this is what was unique about this, is that we involved the officer, the captain, and if they wanted to, the defense rep, in asking what would it take to help you recognize these values that could show other people too the same thing. And we had some really interesting, very, very interesting solutions. But one of the things that I was doing as I was looking at that was I went to the league, the police union, and I started teaching their defense reps. And I said, all right, we're going to have these meetings. I'm going to show you what the process is like. I'm going to tell you how to help save your officer.
Yeah.
And more important, how are you going to develop them? Do you want them to keep making these mistakes?
Yeah.
Do you not want them to adopt the values? You want the same way we do. I understand your bottom line is to keep their job.
Yeah.
But that's, okay, that you just walk in the door with that, but what else? You need to be your brother's keeper.
Yes. Loaded answer, only to say, as you're telling me all this, is would you agree that the punishment is the process and the punishment's not really the penalty? And I say that in a sense that obviously I've worked the assignment, and I know that the process is long.
Yeah.
It can be long. And I always think about a scenario like, let's just say the officer is, it occurred.
Sure.
He or she happened to violate some policy.
Yeah.
Right? 2 years on, driving to work every day, trying to do God's work. And knowing that forecasting and in the future, there's going to be some punishment.
Sure.
Right? But that wait period, that lag time, and the fact that we don't, like you said, we don't explain the values that we're trying to portray to this officer, like, look, you know, this is what we're going to do to kind of ensure that this doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
A lot of times we'll leave them in the dark.
That is really a terrible thing. It doesn't always have to be that way, I've done expert witness work and I've done consulting, and I've seen how the systems work all over the place. Some of them are simpler and more elegant, but they still have the same problem.
Yes.
Which is it takes time to do the investigation. There are exclusions. In other words, certain people you can't talk to and certain things you can't do. And so it has this kind of fearsome tone to it. Mm-hmm. It takes a long time and you don't know what's going to happen.
You're kept in the dark.
Yeah. So in some respects, the process is a punishment.
Yeah.
It's not intended to be. It certainly isn't. Nobody wants that kind of
No,
bureaucracy.
and you know, but we can agree there's got to be accountability somewhere.
Yeah, and so if you're going to have the process as it is ordinarily institutionalized right now, in that the intake, investigation, adjudication, and then disposition, then you're going to have a bureaucracy of different depths depending on how big the department is, and so the bigger the department is, the more likely are you to have different layers of review, because there are some protections in that.
Yeah.
There are also some confusions too, but it protracts the process.
Yes, too many hands in the cookie jar. I
Yes.
was going to ask you that next.
Yeah, but small departments aren't much better, because I worked one case in which you have a very small department and they couldn't get the thing solved in a year.
Yeah.
Come on, guys.
Yeah.
What's going on here? So, I really do sympathize with the officers in that
No,
regard.
totally. I think small departments has more of an impact, the discipline system, than it does in a large machine like ours.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I think, interestingly, that the small department has a better opportunity to use a develop or discharge model than a large department.
I agree. I totally agree.
Part of the reason that I ran into so much resistance, and I did run into resistance,
Yeah.
because it is counterintuitive. Okay, so under the old scheme, you would give this guy 10 days, and now we're going to give him a paper penalty? No, it's not a penalty. It's a conditional reprimand. We're telling you, if you do this again, after we've told you what the values are, you've agreed that you understand the values, and you agree that you're going to abide by the values, you still do it again, guess what? It's going to go off the charts. You may get fired. Big difference. Because
Yes.
one of the things that I told the people who were involved in this, particularly the police commission, politicians, activists, I was dealing with all these people, was that the intention is, let's keep the good ones and develop them when they go awry. But let's get rid of the bad ones fast, really fast. And there are ways of knowing that. So what my system did that the old conventional system, as it would be called, didn't do, was it didn't do that. It had what I referred to as micro-incremental progressive discipline. So you go in these little increments, 2-day suspension, then 4 days, then 10, then 15 or whatever. And what most people don't realize is that system was designed by unions, not by management. And so it was designed to protect jobs, not to actually fulfill the obligation of helping people to become better and to purge the ones who won't.
In those, you got there, congratulations, got promoted in 2007, and you were there for 6 years. And part of that change, let's talk about changes. You spoke about one, about this conditional official reprimand, which I was there, a part of the conditional OR.
Yeah.
I can tell you some people weren't really, happy about it, but some, yes, I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm totally good. So I guess from my experience, I think it was effective. I'm not going to say it wasn't. It was welcomed. But I think some people just felt like, and maybe you can kind of educate me, but some had limitations and some didn't.
Yes, and that's really, I'm glad you brought that up, because remember, I'm walking into this, and it literally is a revolution in the way you think about it. I'm not trying to brag or anything like that, but the way you look at this from the developer discharge is completely different than the how much are you going to punish them. Mm-hmm. So the conditional reprimand at first didn't have a term limit. So if you do this again, then this following the condition would occur.
Okay.
And it'd be quite a jump up from what would be before. Mm-hmm. And what the idea behind that was to show how close to termination are you if you do this again.
Okay.
Now, it could be you're going to get fired. And we did have some of those. Now, the mistake that I made, having no experience in this at all, never having done it before, and that's part of the adventure is wonderful, is that after a few of those, the union came to me and said, hey, does this really have to hang over their head for the rest of their career? And I said, tell me why I shouldn't. And they gave me some really good reasons. Mm-hmm. And I thought through it, and I realized, you know what, they're right. They're right. So what I did was I amended it so that when we would go to the chief, we'd say, all right, here's what we would expect would be a fair time period, after which we start over. And so that was changed. And it was changed at the behest of the union, but it also was a recognition that there was something I missed before I started.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so having never had done it before and I had no baseline. I had nowhere else to go to ask, what do you think about this? There wasn't anybody to go.
Well, let's go on the record now to say that probably the league didn't really do a good job of informing all 13,000 of us at the time, because some people didn't really know that it was probably changed. And that's fair, because sometimes you can't get the message across. I suppose, and again, let's just be clear, and I want to make sure, and I do this all the time with all my guests, and in this particular topic, we're only talking about a very small fraction of the population of the department. Absolutely. We're talking like 0.00001%.
Yeah.
But everybody wants to hear.
Yes.
Right? Everybody's interested.
Yeah.
It's sensational.
It is sensational.
And it's great. I do. I love sensation, but let's kind of, be fair about this. And because we're having this conversation about this conditional official reprimand, that, oh my God, all 13,000 of them, it happened. That's not the case. So I just wanted to make that clear. During your time as an advocate and during your time as a commander in employee relations, as the administrator, part of you walking into this assignment, into internal affairs, did all those experiences kind of made you want to change the world, make changes because of your experience?
Yeah, it really did. And then all the time between them, as employee relations administrator, one of my chief duties was to act as the chief labor negotiator for the department. So I was dealing with unions. I had 21 different bargaining units to listen to. And that was very interesting. And you learn a lot from that. And you learn a lot from grievances, and you learn a lot from what makes people fail. And I also learned how that affected the disciplinary process, as they called it. I didn't really think it was a disciplinary process. I thought it was just a punitive process. And as an officer, and as I was going through the ranks and going up, and especially after the advocate section where my eyes were really open. Yeah. And I said, well, this is kind of a tough system, and it doesn't really get to the bottom line. That was really what started this very many years long process of thinking this through. It wasn't like I showed up at PSB or showed up in the chief's office and just said, oh, I got this brilliant idea. No, it was something I had been thinking about for many years.
In retrospect, if you didn't work as an advocate or an ERG, employee relations, you think maybe your ideas, these changes would have presented themselves in such a way?
I think eventually, yes.
Yeah.
Because when you're confronted with the way the system is, mm-hmm. and you're confronted with the realities of what it does not do, it does not make better people, and it does not rid the bad people.
Yeah.
Not very effectively.
Yeah, no, totally.
Not fast enough. Then you're going to have to ask the question, what will?
Yeah, what will?
So I'd end up back in the same place. These other experiences just made it happen faster.
Before we move on to this official reprimand, this conditional reprimand on reducing recidivism, look, you presented this to the Board of Police Commissioners.
I did.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Take me on that journey.
All right. So realize that we're in a situation where the discipline system, as it was called, was known well by the police commission, by the activists, et cetera, as the system you get rid of people with. Mm-hmm. And you hold them accountable. That's the big thing, is hold them accountable. Well, yeah, of course you want to hold everybody accountable. But how do you do it? So it was counterintuitive to them, mm-hmm. that in the past, where they would look at the monthly or quarterly results of how many disciplinary
penalty
cases.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
The rap sheet.
Yeah, the rap sheet. How many people got 10 days off or 15 days off, et cetera, and all of a sudden they're not there. What happened? And
we don't know who they are.
When this is what was interesting is, what I really realized that I did not realize before this started was just how powerful the emotional attachment was to punishment in the eyes of the police commission, in the eyes of the media, in the eyes of the activists, in the eyes of some of the citizens. Punishment was what they're after. And that wasn't what I was after. So here I am, Mr. I don't want to punish, I want to develop or discharge.
Wow.
And I ran into a wall. So I'm telling the board this. The board says, we want proof that this works. I said, I've only been doing it for a couple of years. You know, it takes a while to figure this out to make sure we actually do reduce like-kind recidivism. In other words, they're not doing the same thing over again. So we want you to do a study. All right, but with the sample size is kind of small, you only got about 100 people or something like that.
Yeah.
So they said, you do it anyway. All right, so they tell the boss to tell me to do it. I do it. So I get the study done. It's way better than I thought it would be. It actually was way more efficient, way more effective. I was actually stunned by the results. So we had this, what was originally based on the study, a 12% recidivism rate under the standard model.
Okay.
Okay?
That's not bad.
Well, no, it's not bad, I guess.
Yeah.
You can quibble over that.
Yeah.
But what did you get when we did this? 2%. Oh. 2%. From 12% to 2%.
It's a big jump.
So you can do it relatively and say, well, you know, it's 6 times better than the other model. Or you can say, absolutely, well, it was 10 percentage points better. Any way you look at it, it's better. So now I present this to the police commission. And they're not terribly thrilled with the fact that this is actually working, and not getting a chunk of flesh out of everybody is actually doing a better job than the old system, which was, 80 years of tradition unmarred by progress. Oh, man. So I show it to them, and then one of them says to me, well, I'm going to take your study and I'm going to take it back to my university, which was USC, and I'm going to have one of my USC PhD sociologists look at this and see if the study was done right. So I looked at him and I said, that would be really helpful, because the person that I had do this, my detective, is a USC PhD in sociology, and she conducted the study. You and she will have a good time talking.
I love it. Wow. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Look, here we are again in talking about changing. You did mention, look, you taught at a post-management school?
Yes.
Yeah, I know that you taught there. Critical thinking. How is it that critical thinking, can you explain to us, works in IA operations?
It works everywhere, but in internal affairs operations.
Yeah, how does that work?
Yeah, so what is critical thinking? I mean, if you've gone to college, you probably took a critical thinking class, so you learned informal fallacies and stuff like that. So I'd been studying critical thinking academically for a long time.
Okay.
And I always wanted to apply it in the real world, because that's really what matters. Mm-hmm. And critical thinking, the definition that I use is the selection, the analysis, the questioning, and the application of information to make a decision or solve a problem. And the one part of it that you won't see in anybody else's definition, and the discernment of cognitive biases in situations where they matter. Now that's you won't find that in, I couldn't find it in any critical thinking books. So what does that mean for internal affairs? Well, let me give you some examples. Let's talk about the thing that really bothers people the most, which is the place where you're actually going to decide somebody's fate. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you have this place where you're going to actually do the adjudication. Now, what happens during adjudication? Well, there are some cognitive biases that actually show up there. Cognitive bias is a systematic pattern that occurs in humans, all of us have them, that can distort thinking or alter us from a rational outcome. So here's one of them. So I'm sitting around a table, and let's say we're brainstorming this particular thing. Mm-hmm. And somebody comes up with an idea, and then the group says, yeah, I like that, but somebody doesn't like it. But they go along with the group. Now, we're used to calling that peer pressure, mm-hmm. but it's actually a cognitive bias, and it goes by another name, groupthink, and that groupthink is a real problem. And if you have a group of people, doesn't matter what their rank is, they're still going to suffer that. So we have to be careful that when you have somebody who's got an opinion different from yours in a group, you need to be quiet and listen. That doesn't always happen. And it has its effects. And then you have another problem, for example, for the investigator. So there's a cognitive bias known as confirmation bias. This is very poisonous. And it occurs not just among internal affairs investigators, it occurs with scientists and investigators of all kinds. Mm-hmm. And that is the tendency to look for evidence that confirms the theory you first have. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now you say, well, of course, you didn't want to do that. But the problem is it actually happens that way. So you have this confirmation bias, and you're going in, and of course you see something, and this is a pattern that you've seen 1,000 times before. It must be the same thing again. That's a problem, because now you're only looking for what you've seen rather than what is really there. Now let's say you're a really astute person, and you've said, okay, I remember hearing Perez talk about confirmation bias. I'm going to make sure that I look for things that would be opposite to what I believe.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Contrary.
Yes.
So what would defeat my theory? I'm going to look for evidence that would defeat my theory.
Yeah.
So you start doing that. There's still another bias that's lingering in the background there. It's called the disconfirmation bias. Now, disconfirmation bias is really interesting because it's one of those kind that you think you're being virtuous and actually you're being vicious.
Yeah.
And so what it is the tendency, after you've decided you're going to look for this other evidence, to scrutinize it in a way you did not scrutinize your own.
Mm. Amen to that. That happens a lot.
It happens a lot.
It happens a lot.
So if you know these biases are likely to occur, then you know when to look for them, and you know what to do to prevent them. And so we can keep going with them, but the bottom line is you see that,
bias.
That particular kind of cognitive bias. There are also things that are really, really important, probably the one that I think is the scariest, and it's called a hindsight bias. And the hindsight bias really has two different features to it. One of them is I knew it all the time, and that's not what I'm talking about. And that's typical, like you watch a sports thing, and your team wins, and they win a certain way, and you say, oh, well, I knew that was going to happen. I knew that guy was going to throw the ball that way.
Got it.
Which is a big lie. You didn't know that. So, but who cares?
Yeah.
But I just want to make sure.
Neither here nor there.
Yeah, I just want to make sure people know that's not the bias I'm talking about. That's a real bias, by the way. Very well studied. So the one that's pernicious, the one that's scary, the one that actually is terrifying in all sorts of ways, is the tendency that people have to see the outcome of a decision in a way that distorts their impression of what the decision was. So, for example, if the outcome was really horrible, people who look at that terrible decision are more likely to believe that the decision was faulty or that the person was at fault than if the outcome was less so. But the outcome of the decision is irrelevant to the decision process.
Yes.
And yet that comes up over and over. And when I was doing my research on that, there were 800 plus studies on that.
Wow.
Particularly when you come to juries. I mean, I even came across a case in which a judge set aside a jury verdict because he could see the hindsight bias.
Yeah.
Said, you guys just assessed this horrific thing because you saw this horrific outcome, but that was way more than what these people could think at the time.
Yeah. That, and if I may interject, that goes to, and I think you were still around, the time where they decided to do that Measure M and change the Border Rights Panel from traditional 2 command staff officers and 1 civilian to 3 civilians. Mm-hmm. Of course, I had my relationships with the league, but no one called Marlon and say, "Hey, what do you think?" Because you were not, you put on these cases. And my position to this very day is, and by the way, the whole theory and the research and the studies were, well, civilians are more lenient. They're not likely to terminate cops, no matter what the circumstances are. And you and I can agree that any off-duty behavior, the scope is super, super narrow. It's macro.
It should be, yeah.
And it should be,
yeah.
Absolutely. But anything that happens on duty, I say this all the time when I teach this, look, if you do something on duty, more than anything, from my experience, even as an internal affairs advocate, you know what? You tend to be very flexible and lenient because things happen. We get that, and that's totally understandable. But to going back to changing the panel, I always thought to myself, look, if I have a civilian panel, and 9 times out of 10 they're attorneys, right? So now you got 3 attorneys, let alone you got the 4th one. You got a room full of attorneys, if you will.
First problem. Yeah.
That's problem number 1,
Yes.
right? You got a lot of attorneys, you know, I like to argue better than you and I have a better theory and so on and so forth. Then the other one is this, is if you're presenting to me with a DUI case, as an example, and I don't know, right, the defense attorney or the advocate, I don't know if any of these panel members has had an encounter personally with someone that was involved in a DUI. I don't know if your daughter or a loved one, family member, was a victim of a DUI. Could be. I don't know.
There's no voir dire for them.
Right.
Yeah.
So then my point is that you really think, honestly, that they're going to listen to everything that you have to say as you're presenting all this evidence and you're hearing all this testimony. I tend to think that, you know what, I'll be checked out. The minute I hear that you were involved in an off-duty DUI incident and perhaps there was some injuries, I think I'm done. You know, and then that shows that bias. So to me, I wasn't really too thrilled with having an all-civilian panel. Look, if it's Marlon Marachi and I had Mark Perez and Joel Justice, for example, he was my boss. He promoted me. If I had them both in my board, you know what? I would trust them more to know that, you know what, Marlon made a mistake, but I'm not going to put the hammer on this guy and, you know, fire him for, you know, a mistake. So those are the differences, and I can totally relate. I didn't know this breakdown of biases, and I really appreciate it. And I know there's a study here that you're going to show me or I'm going to have because that's super, super important. Mark, let me ask you this in terms of biases, because you described a couple. And I always ask this, and this is one of the things that's not so much that it's scary, but it's a very major concern that I get a lot from the rank and file, is there a double standard?
Depends on what you mean by double standard.
What I mean by a double standard is that here you have, let's just say it's a mid-sized organization or even large organizations like LAPD or any other. And by the way, it's not just California. It's not Los Angeles. No. There is, and I'll say it again, and I'll keep saying this, there is over 18,000, okay, north of 18,000 agencies across the entire United States. And there's north of 800,000 officers.
Yeah.
So you and I can agree there's a lot of work to be done, especially when it comes to discipline.
Yeah.
I totally get that. But my question is that, you know, here you are, if you have a DUI, I always refer to you, I don't know why, it's probably the easiest, DUI related.
You just need a beer.
Yeah, I just need one beer, maybe even 2. But what I mean by the rank and file gets a DUI, but then a command staff officer gets a DUI. And, okay, well, you know, he's a captain or commander. He's part of my staff. And I would hate to be in a small agency because it probably sticks out even worse.
Oh, much worse.
Right?
Yeah, it is.
And then here's a rank and file. You got a DUI. Well, you know what? I'm going to hammer this guy in penalty. But with this command staff officer, I'm going to be a little more lenient. In fact, you know, history has shown, and, you know, and let's be honest and be candid, that there's been times, not just LAPD, and I'm sure it happens in a lot of agencies, where we sometimes even sweep it under the rug and don't give it that heavy scrutiny. What's your thoughts?
It's very complicated, so I don't mean to blow it off, because it really is much more complicated than it sounds. It sounds simple. Okay, the command staff has one standard for themselves and another standard for the cops. Very easy to say, very hard to prove. Now,
yes, there's no empirical data. I get that. Yeah,
although there is some empirical reason why it should happen, and so there are studies that describe how people are willing to look at people who are distant from them.
Right.
So you can get into that psychology, which we don't have to get into here. But more to the point of the people who are watching the show today is, think of a couple of things that happen when a command staff officer, particularly in a large organization, but let's leave any organization, what happens when they do that doesn't happen to a police officer? So first of all, their reputation is screwed.
Correct.
Okay, so they are in trouble.
100%.
So if it's sustained, they're going to suffer one punishment that a police officer will never suffer. So right up front, there is a disparity in that right up front.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're right.
There's also a very, very strong likelihood of career death. Okay,
Yeah.
You embarrassed the department. You're a high-level guy. You should not have
It's
done
even worse.
that.
Yeah.
So I don't have to give you 20 days off or
Right.
I've killed you already. Your career.
Well, you
is
kind of killed
dead.
yourself.
You did, yes. Yeah. I mean, so
The dagger was.
yeah. So
I get that part.
Yeah. So the answer is yes. There will be disparities. So I'm not going to say no. That
Yeah.
there isn't a double standard. There is a double standard.
Yeah. There should be.
But there's a complexity to it.
Yes.
That is one of the things that drives me nuts, is that so much of policing seems to be an analysis of black and white. It's this or that, all these faulty dilemmas, rather than really diving in and saying, look, what really is behind this?
Let's think about it.
Be thoughtful. Use critical
Critical
thinking.
thinking.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. And look, and I don't want to sound like a hypocrite. I really don't, because let's just say I was a captain in LAPD and I did get a DUI, and you're my boss. I got to be honest. I don't know if I walk in and say, you know what, Chief, give me the same penalty that you would give that P2. You know, I don't know if I would do that or not, is my point.
Yeah.
And I haven't been in that predicament, and I don't know if that is a form of approaching such a way. And you know, because I keep thinking about, because you know how it is, people tell you, well, you know, they don't get in trouble, we get in trouble. You know, they're protected, we're not. Like you said, there's this disparity. It's true, it has to happen. I didn't really think about the fact that, look, if you're a captain, you get a DUI, your career is pretty much suicide.
It's a roast.
It's a roast
Yeah.
compared to the P2 that, you know.
A couple of years it goes away. They keep everything good.
You're going to get an FTO spot, and, you know, chances are. But that particular level, there has to be some disparate treatment. I totally get that. So I appreciate that.
I would add this one last thing. So if you were to operate under the developer discharge model, you would expect differences.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, you would expect differences among officers, which was one of the problems that lawyers had with it. Because they said, well, that's inconsistent. No, the process is consistent.
Yeah.
It's just the outcomes are different and you don't like that.
Chief Bratton surprised you with something?
Yes, he did. As a matter of fact, you know, people have a lot of different impressions of Bratton. He could scream at you. He would scream at you if you didn't like what you did. Thank God he never did that to me. But one time I was in a meeting with him. It was the top 20 people in the organization.
Okay.
So we're at this big table, 20 people. Chief of police is talking. He's talking, and then somebody else is talking. I don't even remember what it was about. But it wasn't about discipline, and it had nothing to do with what I was doing in the discipline system. So all of a sudden, the chief stops it. Says, "Mark, come over here." I'm thinking, what's this about? You know, it never has happened. So I'm wondering what's going to happen. So I pull my chair back, looking at the chief, and I start walking to the chief. My heart's beating. I'm wondering, well, what am I in for here? So he looks down, he goes under the table, just like I'm doing right here, and he pulls up this, and he hands it to me. So what I'm showing you here is a blow-up of a cartoon that was done in mockery of the discipline system that I created. And it was in a circulation, a newspaper of wide circulation in Los Angeles, and it has cops holding hands, singing Kumbaya, with a couple of cops in the background saying, "Oh, this is a new discipline system." So what Bratton was saying, and what he explicitly said in front of all these people is, "I want Mark to continue doing this. This is what I want to see happen." And he handed this to me. He says, "I know what you're up against."
Wow. And this happened in the beginning or towards the end of...
Around the middle.
Around the middle?
Yeah, because it was at the high point where, you know, I was in front of the police commission very often.
Oh, yes, you were.
And I was in front of the cameras, and I was getting quoted in the newspapers.
Gosh.
I had activists blowing a fuse. I had the union blowing a fuse. I mean, it was pretty interesting.
You were a meet and confer guy for a while.
I was, yeah.
And next thing you know, you get into this pile of mess.
But, you know, I never gave up the idea that it's right to reason with people.
Yeah.
Even people who are unreasonable. And to treat them with dignity and respect, even if they don't treat you that way.
Yeah.
And I don't expect everybody to hear it, but the one thing that I would say is a lesson in all of this is
Yeah. What other
even if
lessons
it's
learned?
counterintuitive, if fundamentally you've done your research and it goes against the grain of everything that everybody else has been doing for the last 100 years, it doesn't mean you don't push through.
Yeah.
And when you have all those kinds of things, if you're a leader, do what Bratton did.
Yeah. No, totally. I'm going to say this in a jokingly manner, but I hate to disappoint you, but when you left, things didn't really get that much better.
I know.
Because you left in 2013. I was there until 2015. As a matter of fact, I put on the border rights hearing involving, the in-custody death with Officer O'Callahan. Which was a landmark case because, the victim, if you will, died inside passed away and died in the police vehicle. And there was discussions and arguments.
Cameras.
Yeah. The cameras and MT, to get medical treatment. And at no point in this particular incident, medical treatment was not requested. And so there was a special order that came out of this. And also what we used to call lack of supervisory oversight, which was that one allegation on the sergeant that was at scene.
Yeah.
It became today is what is known as command and control. So some good things came out of it, but I had my struggles. And, I totally appreciate all this. Let me ask you, let's move on.
Okay.
Let's go to worst incident in your career.
The most horrible thing I ever saw when I was working was when I was a sergeant working Southwest Division. I heard a call of a child drowning. And the request wasn't for the police officers to go save the child. It was that the RA was en route. So the rescue ambulance was on their way. But some cops were not far away. And I wasn't far away. And so those officers got there just before I did. And they went to that swimming pool where that child was, and they took that child out. And the horrifying thing for me wasn't merely that it was a child that had been drowning. It was the child looked exactly like mine. Same age, same skin complexion, same body. I was looking at my own son.
Oh, wow.
It was devastating. I did not know I could feel that. And so that was the thing that bothered me more than anything. I mean, I had tears in my eyes. Yeah. Lord, save this kid.
Yeah, that's tough, man. Hey, thanks for sharing that. Let me ask you this, Mark. Do you feel, and I've been asking this a lot lately to my guests, is, here you have this bookshelf, and when we talk about mental wellness, back in your days in the 80s, probably wasn't even heard of.
No, not much.
Right, 24 years ago, I can tell you, we didn't really think about it either, but do you feel as though that it should get as much as attention as, and when we talk about the shelf, I know when we think of mental wellness, it's suicidal ideations, loss of a partner on duty, killed in the line of duty, or, anything that has to do with attempts or just knowing that your partner or a close friend of in your classmate, if you will, committed suicide. Why is it that we never really paid attention to discipline as it relates to, well, I guess my first question is, do you think disciplines also should be in that shelf when it talks about mental wellness?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because you don't walk out of the discipline system unscathed if you have a sustained complaint. Something in you changes. It'll either change well or it'll change poorly. But it definitely needs to be in there.
Yeah. No, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing all this. Anything before we move on to this book that I want to talk to you about that we can think of as it relates to internal affairs? Man, we covered a lot, and you and I can probably keep going.
We can keep going. I'd love to, but I understand we have time limits. So I left LAPD, did a couple other jobs. I went to work now for a nonprofit, a Christian nonprofit.
Yeah, let's talk about this book.
Yeah.
Tell me all about this book.
So this is the book that one of my coworkers and I just finished writing.
Okay.
It'll be presented to the public in January.
Clear Thinking in a Messy World.
Yes. And so that's a book written by and for Christians, but it has chapters in it that anybody could use. So it's really an argument that we need to use our minds to think clearly. And for the Christian, certainly, we have an obligation religiously to do that. But for everybody else, how do you do it? Well, we describe how you use logic, what kind of problems there are in informal fallacies, and then how does reasoning go awry in using language, and then the cognitive biases. I wrote 4 chapters on that in the end of it. So when my co-author and I, when we were thinking about how would we approach critical thinking, we really wanted to make sure that we had something that people could apply.
That's awesome.
And so that's what that book is about, is how do you go about clearly thinking?
Yeah, no, totally. Hey, thank you. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We're almost at the end. Before we wrap it up, I would like to at least share a little bit of the relationship that we had, or that we kind of didn't have, because it was your partner that hired me, right? Rick Webb, which, by the way, I hope you can get a hold of him for me.
I'd be happy to.
After this episode, hopefully he'll come in and we can have some interesting conversations with Rick.
He would be great.
Yes, absolutely. I got to tell you that we've already covered this. I know that sitting at the top in your umbrella and looking down, there was a lot of good work that was done in internal affairs, and I just wanted to shed some light, at least with you and the 70 plus guests that have come in, that this is not really as bad as you think it is. And there's a big misconception when it comes to this assignment. You shared that you were voluntold, is what they call it nowadays, right? And people keep asking me, like, hey, did you want to go internal affairs? I got to be honest with you, and maybe you can relate to this. In LAPD, there's this culture where when you're a Sergeant 1, you want to get your rocker, which is your Sergeant 2, right? It's considered like a promotion, but not really. It's actually an upgrade. Well, it's 5.5%. It's more money. So yes, you can say it's probably promotion.
And more responsibility.
And more responsibilities. And what ends up happening is a lot of these Sergeant 1s, they want to get that rocker. They want to get that promotion and assume those responsibilities. But I got to tell you, those rockers are far in between to get. I mean, there's like, I don't know, close to 1,000 sergeants. Or more, for that matter.
Well, I think there's only 3 or 4 in a division.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so when the upgrade, right, came up, the advertisement for internal affairs, I got to be honest, I think I was just thinking about, hey, I want to get... But that's not true. I was in the middle of law school. I really enjoyed discipline. I was an ORS as a defense rep. And gosh, I got to tell you, telling my colleagues that, hey, I'm going to go to the dark side was kind of challenging. The one individual, and Cliff, I know you're hope you're listening. Cliff Armis is a legend in LAPD and ORS, and I got to tell you, you were the last person I called to tell that I got the job, because I really thought you were going to bite my head off saying, why the hell you're going to the dark side and going over there? But you were the first one that actually told me, you know what, that's a really good position for you. You're going to learn a lot, and I wish you the best. So I thank you, Mark, for all that. Before we leave, any advice that you have for anyone who's even thinking about applying to become a police officer? What kind of advice would you give them?
Come in knowing that when you're doing the work, you're doing a good work. It's not an occupation, it's a calling. And when you get there, be worthy of your calling. Do it well. Do it well because the people who are there who need you badly. And when you look at all the bureaucracy that goes on around you, don't let it faze you. Be who you are and be really, really good. And that's what I would recommend.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I went through the whole show calling you Mark, but I had to call you Chief. You were, you have that respect, and thank you so much for showing up. And if you like this episode, please don't forget to click on the next one. It's going to be just as good, if not even better. So on that note, like always, please be safe out there. And don't forget to go Code 6. Thank you.